For those of you who don't know me, my name's Penny Williams. I'm one of the co-leads in Program 5, the Human Robot Workforce in the Cobotics Centre. And today I'm going to be presenting with our postdoctoral research fellow, Dr. Melinda Laundon, and we're going to talk about the challenges of managing change. The reason we thought we'd talk about this is it's a point that comes up in a lot of conversations that we've had with manufacturers and organisations generally who are trying to adopt technologies, and there is an associated issue with, managing the change processes that come with that. But before we begin, I'd like to first acknowledge the Turrbal and Yugara, the First Nations owners of the lands from which I'm joining you today, and also Melinda. And I'd also like to acknowledge the First Nations owners of the lands from wherever you're joining us online today, and pay my respects to their elders, laws, customs, and creation spirits. And recognise that these places and spaces have always been a place where we can share knowledge and teach and undertake research and learn from each other. All right, well, as I mentioned, one of the key challenges to cobot adoption is the associated organisational change. So today we're going to try and help you make a little bit of sense of that problem by giving you an overview of some of the management research and some of the long-standing theories that are associated with change and change management. Now, some of what I'm going to present today is quite old and you might have heard of it before, but a lot of it still holds true. And the reason I think it's important for us to revisit some of these models and frameworks is because it's a really useful way for us to step back and think about what change is, why it's problematic, but also what can be done about it. And, in doing this, I really do want to acknowledge that every change scenario is different, every organisation is different. But some of these frameworks really give us a way of unpacking what's happening within an organisation or preparing for a process of change that we might want to implement. And it can help us develop strategies to ease that process. And so we will have some hints and tips, I guess, along the way. I'm going to actually be presenting the first 3 sections that you see on the slide here. And then Melinda's going to finish off today by sharing some insights with you as they specifically apply to manufacturing and the role of manufacturing leaders in managing change. Okay. All right, so what is change? So first of all, change can be planned or unplanned. So change can be something, so basically what I mean by that is change can be something that happens to us, right? So it can happen to an organisation, and COVID is, I guess, the, exemplar that we all can refer to, where change was imposed upon us and organisations needed to adopt a reactive response to that change. But most change, particularly in relation to technology adoption, is planned change. So it's a deliberate action that we take to do things differently in an organisation. So adopting a cobot is something we choose to do. So it's a planned change that we can then plan for. Now, it's important to think that planned change it can be radical or it can be incremental. So it can occur in small increments over a long period of time. So if we think about something like, changing the gender makeup of your workforce, might be something that you do over time through a series of policy and practice changes. So you might change the way that you recruit and who you recruit. You might introduce flexible work policies or other supporting policies in order to change the composition and the way that the organisation looks and operates. But radical change is done more quickly. It's often dramatic, and in that way it can be disruptive. And the adoption of a new technology, even something that might appear relatively innocuous or simple or obvious, can represent a radical change because it's a new way of operating, a new way of doing something that's implemented fairly quickly and makes a disruption, whether it be just to one job or a task or to an entire process. And for that reason, plan change is something that we have to plan for. So this means that we have to go through a process of steps or process flows to affect that change. And if we don't do that, we can have a whole series of unintended consequences. And those kind of steps or process flows are what everyone really calls change management. And we can understand change management from some of the classic theories and models of change. Okay, so here's two fairly old theories, but oldies but goodies. So Lewin's change theory is actually one of the original theories of change. And it basically, Lewin states that to change the current situation, we have to unfreeze the status quo. So on this slide, you'll see the little symbols. So Lewin is the 3 stages at the top of those symbols. So Lewin says, okay, the organisation is a state of freeze, remembering that this is kind of an old approach, a state of freeze. So we have to unfreeze and disrupt the status quo within the organisation in order to adopt the new change and the new way of doing things and refreeze into a new way, or institutionalise or embed the change in the way that we want it to. Now, Menikis and colleagues have a similar approach. So they say that we need to consider the organisation's current situation and its readiness for change. So where are we now? How ready are we as an organisation to make this change? Then in the next step, we have to adopt whatever it is that's going to be the change before we can institutionalise or embed it as the final phase. Now, these 2 models suggest a linear approach with a start and a finish. And we all know change is actually not like that, particularly in this current day and age. So these theories have been adapted over time to consider them as a cycle of continual change, where the organisation is working through a process of freezing, unfreezing, refreezing, and going through various types of change almost on a constant basis. So if you think about your own organisation or an organisation that you're familiar with, you can kind of see how this operates in practice. So even as one small change occurs in an organisation and is embedded, another small change might be beginning or already underway. And that might be happening in a series of places within the organisation continually over time, and those change processes might be overlapping. So collectively, this can amount to a significant amount of organisational change that can be disruptive and difficult to manage. So these theories have been criticised, and we've moved on from them, mostly because they don't explain the complexities of those change processes that I just described. And they're a little bit too simplistic. They also don't tell us why change fails. So if it's that easy, why isn't it working? And there's been a significant amount of research that suggests that change can often fail. And these are some of the reasons that research has told us. And you'll see here that most of these reasons are actually related to human factors. So the fact that individuals have a fear of the unknown, they don't know what the future is going to look like and what does this change mean for them. We generally have a sense, a felt need for security. And so if we don't know what impact the change will have on us, where our natural reaction is to resist that or to feel insecure. We mightn't see a need to change at all. We might basically say, well, things are working around here. If it's not broke, don't fix it. Why would we move on? And so if there's no sense of urgency for that change, then it's difficult to get people to buy into it. For some people in organisations, a significant change can threaten their power and their influence, and so they might want to resist it. But we also might have contrasting interpretations or understandings of what the change is and what it means. And if you just think about many of the conversations that we've had in the centre about what cobots are, there are different views about what a cobot is and how it should be adopted or used across the manufacturing sector. So that might also occur within an organisation. Often too, there's a lack of values alignment in that individuals in the organisation might think that the direction the organisation is taking is not aligned to their own personal values. There's also just simply really kind of structural issues like poor timing, a lack of resources, and generally a mistrust of management or habits or norms. Now, some of these last few things like norms and mistrust of management speak to something that is really closely related to organisational change, and that's organisational culture. So I'm not going to talk a lot about organisational culture because there's an awful lot to say and we just simply don't have the time today. But you really can't talk about change without touching on culture. So I'm really just going to give you a broad overview about what I mean by culture and why change, even technology change, also influences a change in organisational culture. So organisational culture was defined by Edgar Schein. He's kind of considered to be the leader, thought leader in organisational culture. And he defined organisational culture as the basic pattern of shared assumptions, values, and beliefs, considered to be the correct way of thinking about and acting on problems and opportunities in the organisation. So in Schein's definition, culture manifests at 3 basic levels within an organisation. So firstly, there are the observable artifacts, and you can see this in the iceberg picture that we've got here. So it's often considered to be, depicted as an iceberg. So there are the physical things that we can see that represent our organisational culture. This might be whether we wear a uniform, what our workspaces look like, the terms and the lingo that we use within our organisation that represent us. Then just below the surface, there are our values and norms. That, of course, consists of our espoused values, what we actually tell people we value in the organisation, but it's also the values that we hold dear that we might not verbally express. And also the way we behave in the organisation. So what we consider to be a normal way of behaving. And at the most deep level, underlying that are our underlying beliefs and assumptions. So this is the taken for granted ways of doing things or behaving in an organisation. And this stuff is the most difficult to change because it's often not conscious. It's not something that we really think a lot about. So this might be things that our employees hold dear to them about the organisation, but they might never have stopped to actually consider deeply why those things matter, or even if it's still relevant. And I think the little cartoon on the left-hand side of the screen kind of illustrates this very well, where you've got the 2 guys sitting in the office with the crazy hats on, and the new guy is asked, why are we wearing it? And the response is, I don't know how it started either. All I know is it's part of our corporate culture. So this kind of illustration really shows, the observable artifact here is the hat, and the underlying beliefs and assumptions are, well, never really questioned it. You don't question it. It's just the way that we do it around here. And the norm is that we all wear the hat. So it's really important to understand how even a small change like the adoption of a cobot is a process of culture change too, and how we can manage and adjust these layers along the way. So John Cotter helped us to kind of understand this process of organisational and cultural change by breaking it down into 8 steps. So Cotter's model says that before you can affect change, you first need to establish if there's an urgency for change. And if there isn't, you need to create a sense of urgency. And so if you think of Lewin and Armenicus, this is really simple to that kind of assessing the readiness for change or, unfreezing the situation. So Cotter says that once you've established a sense of urgency, you then need to create a guiding coalition, which you can think of in terms of change champions. So you need to find the key people in the organisation that are going to help you affect this change. And that's not necessarily the leaders. It might be key employees in the organisation that are early adopters or that have a really strong influence. And can bring a different perspective, but bring people along with them in making the change. Importantly, you have to develop a clear vision of what it will look like once the change has been implemented and communicate that vision broadly. Then, of course, empower people around you to act on that. And that means pulling together the resources, whether it be financial or physical, to make it happen. And in some cases, that might mean going externally to get those resources. Once you've started to see some change occur, you've got to identify the short-term wins and then consolidate and build on those. So communicate those short-term wins out, then build upon them by replicating them in other parts of the organisation. And then you'll get to a point where you can institutionalize the change. And that means that once you've institutionalized the change, you've established a new way of doing things around here that just essentially becomes the norm. So Lewin suggests that when you look at that first step of Cotter's model of developing a sense of urgency in order to affect change. So if you think of this in terms of cobot adoption, right, you've got to create and identify the need for cobot adoption and why it's important for us to, do this or any kind of technology. But Lewin suggests in doing this, in order to think about whether technology, whether the change is going to work or not, you have to do a force field analysis. So you've got to identify what are the driving forces that are pushing for the change and what are the restraining forces. So what are the things that are going to resist or stop the success of the change? So if you look at this slide, you can see that a lot of the forces that resist change are often related to organisational culture or to a general sense of technology resistance. And a lot of the forces that drive change are related to managing the change process. So things like developing and communicating the vision and empowering people to affect change. And you can see that especially in that kind of black writing in that driving forces box. So this is really important because during a period of change, you're likely to experience both of those things at the same time. And the idea of affecting change is that you need to increase the driving forces to minimize the restraining forces and make the change successful. So if we apply this idea to manufacturing or the adoption of cobots, from some of the research we've done here in the Cobotics Centre, we already know that some of the drivers for cobot adoption are things like competition and remaining competitive, the fact that our competitors globally and technology has advanced such that we have new automated processes and new technology that means we can do things more efficiently. We've got skills and labour shortages and we need to reduce our costs. So that's kind of driving that need for change. On the other side, things that are resisting it are a sense of not understanding whether a cobot is the right solution, whether there is a visible need for cobots or some other form of technology, a sense from workers that this might result in, might threaten their jobs, but also it might mean they have to develop new skills. And do they want to do that? And of course, we've got the simple thing of costs being a factor to consider. Okay, so where do you even start with all of this information? So Johnson and colleagues actually gives us a really good basis for assessing the capacity or readiness for organisational change. So we might know what our driving forces are, and we might know what our resisting forces are, and we know broadly the steps that we have to do to kind of implement this change. But how do we really establish if we're ready to do this? And what are the factors that we need to focus our time, energy, and resources on? So I like to use this as a kind of a checklist, I guess, to use within an organisation to assess where you might experience issues and where to put your energy and attention. Now, it's a circle because you can start anywhere in this circle. So I'll briefly go through it, kind of using cobots as an example. So one of the best places to start, I think, is preservation. So identifying if you're going to introduce a new technology or any kind of organisational change, what resources and characteristics need to stay? So what do you want to keep that you don't want to change? So what if it's cobots, what tasks might change, might stay the same? What don't you want disrupted in the process? So identify what's going to remain constant that you have to preserve. Then diversity is identifying who is affected. Organisations are made up of a diverse range of jobs and processes. So thinking that you need to think about your organisation in terms of those differences and identify whether this is a change that's going to affect pretty much everyone, or is it going to affect just a small group or a small number of groups? Will they be affected in the same way or in different ways? And will they have different reactions to the change? If you can identify that, then you can think about different ways to communicate and to manage the expectations of those different groups. So which jobs will be affected and how will they be affected? The capability is about, do we have the capability to implement the change? Now, that doesn't just mean the people that are actually going to implement it, but do we need outside assistance? Do we know what we have to do? Can we bring some resources in? Can we provide some people with additional support? Do we have the capacity? So what resources do we need to throw at this to make the change? What funds are available? What people have we got dedicated to do it? And where are our gaps in that? And how might we fill those gaps? Then it's also thinking about where the power lies. So, readiness. I missed readiness. So we kind of talked about this already. Is there a felt need for the change? And then where does the power lie? So there are different groups in our organisation with different power bases and different stakeholders that we need to consider. So what power does the leader who's driving the change have to drive that change? But also, who are the other stakeholders with vested interests? How might the union react to this particular change? How might kind of employee groups react? And how do we influence the power structures in order to affect the change in a really positive way? What's the scope? Is this a large scale change, or is it small, incremental? Is it dramatic? Is it something we can do over a long time march? And that's the final point, time. When do we need to do it? And what's the pace? How urgent is it? And therefore, how quickly do we need to throw resources? And these are all interrelated. So obviously, if it's a dramatic change that needs to happen quickly, like COVID was imposed upon us, then we need to throw more capacity at it, and we need to quickly identify who is affected and how. So they're all interrelated, and using them as a checklist, but thinking about how that then feeds what you do to make that change becomes really important. So as I said, I find this is a really kind of useful tool for preemptively managing issues that might arise. But I'm going to hand over to Melinda now to give you a few more kind of specific examples of what some of these things might look like in practice. and the role of manufacturing leaders in supporting those change processes before we kind of open to a question and answer session.
Thanks, Penny. So one of the elements of the change kaleidoscope that Penny was just discussing was thinking about who's affected and how they'll be affected by changes to technology or what you want to change within your organisation. So this technology acceptance model, which originated from 1989, is still a very widely used tool to help us understand at that individual worker level of people's attitudes and intentions to adopt new technology. So we can think about who's going to be affected when introducing technology such as cobots and use this model to understand workers' perspectives and perceptions. So the technology acceptance model, or the TAM, includes elements such as perceived ease of use of the technology. And perceived, it's important to note that this may be different to whether they're actually easy to use. And so as manufacturing leaders and managers, it's important to think about how you might want to make sure that employees have the right perceptions of ease of use. So not just hearsay or judging it on what they think will happen or what they see the technology as, but instead making sure that they really understand how they'll be supported to learn to use it, how other organisations have successfully used it, and if possible, which I'll talk about in a moment, it's important to have hands-on experience of the technology and perhaps use some change agents within the organisation to make sure that people can actually experience in a pilot program. So you can see that this model shows that perceived ease of use influences the perceived usefulness of the technology. So whether people think it will actually make their job better and more interesting, whether they think it'll make their job safer and more productive too. And both of these things influence whether and how people intend to use the technology, and then therefore how they actually use it. So while the technology acceptance model helps us to understand whether there is resistance to change in adopting new technology, we do need to understand how to overcome the resistance and encourage the adoption of technology such as cobots. So this model by McShane and Co. has actually been implemented in manufacturing before successfully to identify the key elements and the key actions that organisations can take to ensure successful technology adoption. So to summarise, the strategic vision is the most important overlaying element of this because it comes from the leaders, it gives direction, it minimises workers' fear of what the change might involve, it sets expectations of the new behaviour. It's vital for establishing a basis for evaluation of whether things are working, and it's also vital to communicate what leaders see as the expected behaviour of workers in the future. So the second element here of change agents, this aligns with the guiding coalition step from the Cotter model that Penny talked about earlier. So if you can think in your organisation, there's always some key people who are heavily networked. People rely on them for knowing how things work. They know they can rely on them to be the early adopters of the new technology and to give other people advice and learning and development on how it will work within the organisation. You can harness that guiding coalition to help you diffuse change within the organisation. And so pilot projects are commonly used to implement new Industry 4.0 technology. So there's various studies around showing that pilots have successfully helped the adoption within large manufacturers of technology such as digital twins. There's not many specific pilot project studies yet on cobots, but we hope that there will be some coming out of this centre very soon. So the main elements of pilot projects are that incremental diffusion of change. So if you can exhibit to your workers that it can be implemented on a small scale as a translation project, perhaps, that this thing could actually work in the organisation, that some colleagues are successfully working with the new technology, that you can learn lessons from those pilot projects and make sure that people who've been involved in the pilot projects are then communicating about them to other areas of the organisation and then going and working in other areas of the organisation where you want to expand, for instance, digitalisation, then you can make sure that those changes gradually get diffused and embedded throughout the organisation. So there's some HR practices that also need to support these changes, and they can occur at all levels of this model. So this is things like leadership development and coaching, making sure that the values are aligned throughout the whole process, making sure that employee reward systems line up with the change as it occurs and people who are responding to the change, a job redesign if needed, and in some cases there might need to be recruitment of some new talent to fulfill some skills needs. So this slide shows some of the research that we've done so far from the Human Robot Workforce Research Program. So in our interviews with manufacturing leaders who've successfully implemented some advanced manufacturing technology, this is the key issues they see as being important for leaders to consider. So firstly, they say it's important to have that vision and communicate it. So create cultures where technology and innovation is embraced. And this goes back to what Penny was discussing earlier about the importance of organisational culture and ensuring that the culture is open to change, making workers central. So what the leaders and managers that we've talked to have said is that you need to constantly reinforce the value of workers' existing skills while also communicating the value proposition to them of knowing that they'll obtain new skills from working with new technology. So, for example, there's been some research that's come out of the UK based on large-scale studies of workers who have worked with advanced technology, and it's shown that those workers are almost redundancy-proof. They're always going to be in demand because they've got the edge in having experienced and working with those advanced technologies. So that's important for workers to know about and for leaders to communicate. Investing in the development of workers is critical as well. So our interviews also show that it's important for leaders to invest in their own change management skills. So sometimes this can be difficult in smaller manufacturing companies where you may not have much time or resources, but it doesn't have to be formal development that you undertake in this area. It can be gained by networking with other manufacturers who have successfully experienced change, by reading and hearing about experiences from other places. But there are also various ways that you can, say, partner with centres such as the Cobotics Centre to draw on our expertise in this area as well. So finally, we've just got a little quote here from a CEO of an advanced manufacturer who just talks about the importance of management and leadership driving where the business is going and driving the change. Okay, so now we'd like to hear your perspectives. So we're interested in any questions that you might have about anything you've heard from us today, but we're also particularly interested in hearing if any of these models have lined up with your experience of change. So please feel free to put your microphone on if you'd like to, or you can type it to the chat as well.
Have we overwhelmed you all with theories of change?
Eric here from
Hopefully you
BNR
can hear
Enclosures. Thought I'd chime in with something.
Yes, certainly.
Just the note that you made there, putting the coming from the workers first. I think, yeah, that absolutely rings true from our experience as well. Any sort of change in new technology adoption, it can't be a push from the technology. It has to be like a pull system where you sort of drop a few seeds here and there and say, oh, it wouldn't be nice if we did this, and then say, oh, hang on, I've got something here that can do that for you, and leaving that seed that way and sort of having the technology pull from the actual people doing the work. I think that's the best way that things can happen that way. So yeah, no, it definitely rings true with us. Yep.
Thanks, Eric. That's a really good insight. Yeah, certainly our experience in lots of different organisations is that once you get the buy-in of some key employees and they can see the value, not only can they diffuse that kind of sense and adoption across the organisation, but they often generate new innovations and new ideas from that process. So it can have these flow-on benefits that perhaps you weren't even anticipating to begin with.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's great.
Hi, Penny and Melinda. Just a small question about that. We know that change is very important in every organization, and as you said, that the leaders are the people who are going to make it happen, or in what way it's going to happen. So my question is: so mostly technology, when it comes to technology implementation, so there are short-term, medium-term, and long-term changes will happen in the organization. So with my experience in the manufacturing industry, most of the changes will fail because leaders want to get it done immediately and immediate results expecting. So that's the main reason sometimes you are not giving enough time to people to adhere and people to digest those things and get their things. So what do you think about that? The leaders' behavior on pushing these things and getting it done in a halfway way.
Look, I would have to say I agree with you on that point, Akash, that, I think every one of us has probably experienced an organisational change that we felt was happening too fast for us to adapt to. And it is a balancing act because I guess from the leader's perspective and the organisation's perspective, there's significant costs associated with implementing change or often driving that change. So the faster you get it done, the more cost effective it is. But what you often need to balance that with is the pace and your organizational culture and the level of resistance that exists within your organization. So if you have an organization that's used to technology, used to innovation, fairly agile, they might be able to adapt even though there's some discomfort in the process. You're never going to avoid the discomfort that comes with that kind of organizational change. But if you've got, an organization that has very strong values, very embedded ways of doing things, that will be far more disruptive. And perhaps that's a deliberate strategy that you want to happen, knowing that some people might go in that process, but you might also want to make sure that you're keeping the people that you want and involving them in that change process. So it's definitely a balancing act. And this is where it comes down to understanding, to using that checklist, I suppose, that kaleidoscope and thinking about what do we want to keep? What don't we want to change? So what do we want to make sure we don't damage in the process of implementing this change? And how do we protect that, even if we've got to do this in a really short time frame? And that then comes down to the resources you put towards it, how you communicate the vision, and how you create a sense of urgency. I guess the last point I'd make on that is what we have seen in a lot of our early research here in the Cobotics Centre is that some of the technology resistance that might occur within an organisation is not necessarily because the worker is fearful of the technology. It's often a result of an experience that worker has had with a past organisational change that was damaging. So they're therefore skeptical and resistant to any future change. So it's very important, I think, for leaders to be cognizant that by forcing things and not involving employees and managing the pace and communicating well, they could be making long-term damage for future changes.
And part of the way to fix or remedy that as well is going through Cotter's last steps of diffusion. So empowering people to enact a change and celebrating small wins and consolidating and building on that. So by going back to those small steps of change, you can help people to trust in change processes again. Muge, thanks for your comment in the chat about the impact of creating demonstrators for tech adoption. Would you like to give us an example of one of those that you've been involved with?
Yeah, sure. I mean, in our previous design robotics project, most of the people here in the team, like John and Melinda, can comment on it as well. We did create a demonstrator of how the cobot can be utilized, and it has been shown in most of our meetings as well. Is the lynching task with the employee working with the cobot side by side. It just gave such a like a ease of use and positive outcomes. So the companies managed to assess validate the time that the robot can do the task and how much time was necessary to set it up, so they can compare it with their existing costs. And also it just created this demonstrator that the tech adoption is possible, which also motivated the workers so then to work with those type of cobots more often. And the company allowed the worker to have additional time to actually learn a bit of the use of the robot. So it's really important, that training aspect of how the manufacturers can support their workers to achieve that. Since then, they have adopted similar robots in their workplace, and it has been a quite success. So having this type of small demonstrator projects, which we have been doing within the ACC, is really important.
Thanks, Muge. Okay, well, before we finish up, for anybody that is interested in learning more, our slides will be available, I think, and there's a whole bunch of references where you can read more about the stuff that we talked about today. So I think we've got one more point in chat.
Oh, sorry, guys. This is Jeffrey here from Oslo Ships. I just wanted to make one final comment. In terms of change agents, I've observed in the past where, combining young, sort of young, intelligent graduates with very experienced operators, and having, I guess, the wisdom, combining the wisdom and intelligence sort of brings out some real good innovations and help facilitates, technology adoptions. I'm just, I guess, curious to see if similar observations have been made in other industries by other people.
That's a really good point, Jeffrey. And I think, that's a good way also of doing what Melinda mentioned earlier, which is acknowledging the value of the existing skills and knowledge base, but also encouraging innovation. Has anybody else got any comments on that or applied that in their own organisation?
I have a question. Can you
Sorry?
hear me?
Yes,
you-
Eleanor?
Okay, yes. Yes, I personally faced the problem when I was doing research in an organization in a small enterprise, and I had to collect data on how the task was performed to understand what was the space for, if there was the space to implement a cobot, and sometimes the workers were kind of reluctant to share their knowledge, their expertise with me. And yeah, if you have some tips about how to approach this and what you think could be the reason why they don't want to share how their secrets, you know, because in the end it's like a secret.
I think that simply comes down to the old knowledge is power. So, Eleanor, I think that's possibly because they're not sure how sharing that information will be used. And they may be experiencing some kind of fear or resistance. So, about that, sharing that knowledge, meaning that they might then be devalued in the process. So if they share it with you, we can build technology to do it. What job do I have, if we want to be quite blunt about it? But so it's really about coming back to understanding and communicating why their knowledge is valuable and assuring them that they're safe in the process of doing that, and that it's going to actually be a benefit to them, not have a negative consequence at the end of it. So I think that brings us to our time, the end of our time today. So thank you everyone for your great input and those fantastic suggestions, and feel free to reach out to anyone in Program 5 if you'd like to know more along the way, or if you need any assistance with your change management in the process. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.